Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
I was halfway through my second cold coffee of the day, staring blankly at the dashboard of my dusty Toyota Corolla as the evening sun dipped behind a Walgreens sign, when it hit me, today was my birthday. Not tomorrow, not next week, not sometime in August, but today. And no one had called. Not a single damn soul had remembered. I didn't even get one of those cheap Facebook posts from a high school classmate I hadn't spoken to in 20 years. It was like the world had collectively decided I didn't exist, or maybe I just mattered so little that even the algorithm skipped me this year. I let out this laugh, one of those bitter, dry little chuckles that comes from somewhere deep in your gut when disappointment is no longer a surprise, but more of a routine. I wiped my mouth, pulled the sun visor down, and looked at myself in the tiny mirror. My lipstick had faded, my eyes had that puffy end-of-day exhaustion look, and my hair, pulled into a too-tight ponytail, made me look more like someone who stocks shelves at night than someone who just turned 37. But the worst part wasn't how I looked. It was the emptiness. The kind that sits behind your ribs and hums low all day, waiting for the smallest thing, like a forgotten birthday, to confirm every suspicion you've had about your place in the world. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed to my parents' place, mostly out of habit. Jenna, my younger sister, the golden girl, the one with the new condo and the housewarming invite that, of course, landed on my birthday, had texted that morning saying, "Come by tonight. Mom's making dinner." Gonna be cute. Cute. That word she always used like a band-aid for awkward things, like breakups or dead pets, or our family's complete inability to acknowledge any kind of real emotional depth. I didn't even want to go. But something in me, maybe a leftover instinct from when I still believed I'd be seen if I just tried hard enough, told me to show up. Maybe they'd surprise me. Maybe they'd light a candle and bring out a cupcake. Maybe Mom had just forgotten temporarily and would remember once I walked in, and everyone would laugh and hug and say, "We could never forget you, Ratch." But the second I walked through that front door and saw the living room decked out with "Welcome Home Jenna" banners, a spread of finger foods on the coffee table, and my mom's proud, glowing face as she hugged Jenna tight without even glancing in my direction, I knew exactly how the night would go. I stood there for a full 30 seconds before anyone noticed. Jenna waved at me with a wine glass in hand and that effortless, breezy smile she'd perfected since middle school, the one that made teachers and neighbors and boyfriends fall over themselves for her. Mom turned around, and her expression was blank for a heartbeat too long before she forced a smile. "Oh honey," she said, dabbing her hands on a dish towel as she walked over and kissed my cheek lightly, "I thought your birthday was next week." There it was. Again. It wasn't the first time, and deep down I knew it wouldn't be the last. She'd forgotten when I turned 13, forgot again at 21, although she claimed she miswrote the date in her planner, and last year she texted me a day late with a generic, "Hope you had a great day," followed by a coupon for Applebee's. Not even a gift card, just a damn coupon. But tonight hit different. Maybe it was the timing, maybe it was my own creeping sense of irrelevance, or maybe it was the years of pretending like it didn't hurt finally catching up to me. I looked around the room, saw my dad hunched in the corner recliner watching muted baseball highlights, Jenna holding court with some of her real estate friends, Mom bustling around with a tray of deviled eggs, and I felt like a ghost. Like I had walked into a party I wasn't invited to, even though I shared blood with everyone in that room. "So proud of her," Mom said loudly, motioning to Jenna. "Buying her first place all on her own. She's just like me at her age. Driven, focused, knows what she wants." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. I didn't remind her that Jenna had been bailed out of every mistake she ever made. Mom co-signed her first lease. Dad paid off her credit card debt last fall, and just 2 months ago, Jenna had borrowed $2,000 from me to help cover moving expenses. But yeah, totally self-made. I smiled tightly and walked into the kitchen, needing a minute to breathe. The familiar scent of pot roast and rosemary hit me like a wave, and I found myself remembering all those nights growing up when I'd sit at this very table, trying to finish my homework while Mom grilled Jenna about cheer tryouts or yearbook deadlines. I was the quiet one. The easy one. The one who didn't need attention. and so I didn't get any. Suddenly, I heard her behind me. "Let me make you a special tea," she said softly, with a kind of warmth in her voice I hadn't heard in years. I turned around and saw her reaching into the pantry with delicate movements, pulling out a tin of loose herbs I didn't recognize. "You always liked chamomile, right? Something relaxing. You look tired." There it was. That subtle edge, the little twist of the knife. Not "you look beautiful," not "you look happy," but "you look tired." Like all my exhaustion was a character flaw. I looked at her hands as she stirred the pot, slow, measured, precise, and something flickered in the back of my mind. A memory? A warning? I couldn't quite tell. I just nodded and watched in silence. She poured the tea into 2 ceramic mugs, mine the usual chipped one with faded sunflowers, Jenna's a newer one that said "Boss Babe" in gold letters. I smiled, walked over, and as casually as flipping a light switch, swapped the mugs. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did, and just didn't care. As I walked back into the living room, carrying both cups, I sat beside Jenna and handed her the one meant for me. We clinked mugs, and she downed hers in 2 gulps like it was just more wine. A few seconds passed. Then she set the mug down slowly, her hand trembling. Her eyes went wide. She turned to Mom. "Mom, what was in that?" Mom froze. And I just sat there, calm as ever, sipping mine slowly like nothing had happened at all. "Now, let me ask you something. If you knew your own mother had it out for you, had always had it out for you, but no one believed you, what would you do when you finally had proof? Would you call her out? Would you walk away? Or would you just maybe give her a taste of her own medicine? Tell me in the comments." There's something eerie about the way a person moves when they think they're doing something secret, something only meant for them, not to be noticed, questioned, or remembered, and in that moment, standing just outside the kitchen doorway with my arms folded tightly across my chest and my back pressed against the floral wallpaper I used to peel at as a kid during long, boring dinners, I watched my mother with a kind of detachment that didn't feel like anger or fear, but more like observation. Like I was watching a documentary on a predator preparing its trap. She didn't rush. That was the first thing that struck me. There was no nervousness in her steps, no glances over her shoulder, no twitchy hands. Instead, she moved with this calm, controlled grace, the kind she always had when she was baking lemon bars for the church fundraiser or wiping down the baseboards even though no one but her ever cared if they were clean. She took down the old ceramic teapot I hadn't seen since maybe my 20s, the one she used to bring out when guests came over, the one I wasn't allowed to touch because it was fragile and special. She set it on the stove, filled it with water, and reached without hesitation toward the far right corner of the pantry, behind a stack of expired bouillon cubes and stale crackers, where she pulled out a plain, unmarked brown bag that looked like it hadn't seen the light of day in years. I didn't say a word. I didn't step forward. I didn't even blink. She opened the bag carefully, the way you do when something inside matters, and scooped out a small pinch of something dry and green, too green, if you ask me, too vibrant to be the kind of sleepy time herbs people usually keep around, and dropped it into the strainer like it was just another teaspoon of sugar. Then, just as casually, she added some chamomile from the little blue tin she'd always had since I was a teenager, stirred them together, and poured the steaming water over the mix, letting it steep as she hummed under her breath. Some old tune from the 70s she used to sing while folding laundry, back when I thought maybe she was just strict, not cruel. I stepped into the kitchen then, making just enough noise for her to know I was there, but not enough to startle her. She didn't flinch. She just turned, smiled that overly soft smile that never reached her eyes, and said, "You'll feel better after this, sweetheart. Trust me." And maybe that was the moment, the very second, when everything inside me settled. Not exploded, not boiled over, not cracked or snapped or shattered like you'd expect in a dramatic movie, but just settled. Like dust on a bookshelf. Like something old and forgotten finally finding its place. Because that smile, that exact phrase, "trust me," was the same one she used to say when I was 7, and she told me it was okay to miss my field trip because those places are full of germs anyway, or when she insisted I stay home from prom because I looked pale and wouldn't have fun. It was her pattern, her rhythm, her weapon of choice. And I had memorized it like a soldier memorizes the weight of a gun. She poured the tea into 2 mugs, the same ones from earlier, the faded sunflower one with the chipped handle, the one I always got, and the newer, sleeker white one with Boss Babe in shiny gold lettering. The one Jenna had brought from her new apartment last week when she came over to help organize Mom's spice rack. She set them both down on the counter and turned toward me, holding them out like a priest offering communion, as if this was some sacred moment, some mother-daughter bonding she could pretend to remember later when she needed to tell the story to friends. I reached for the mugs without hesitation, smiled warmly, and said, "Thanks, Mom. This means a lot." I watched her face as I picked up both cups, her eyes following my hands like she was watching for a misstep, a change, a flicker. But I kept my expression smooth, my tone easy, my posture relaxed. No tension. No accusation. Just polite gratitude, like I hadn't spent the last 20 minutes questioning whether or not the woman who gave birth to me had just brewed me a quiet little funeral. When I stepped back into the living room, the music had shifted to something softer, Fleetwood Mac, probably, and Jenna was still perched on the edge of the couch, flipping through pictures on her phone, showing someone the backsplash in her new kitchen. I walked over, handed her the Boss Babe mug with a casual, almost playful wink, and said, "You looked like you could use something warm." She didn't even hesitate. She smiled, took the cup, and said, "Thanks, Ratch," like I was just her big sister and not the girl who'd spent her entire life playing second fiddle to her bright, shiny existence. I took the sunflower mug, settled next to her, and took a slow sip, not deep, not rushed, just enough to wet my lips and complete the scene. Jenna, though, she drank like she always did, confidently, thoughtlessly, the way someone drinks when they believe the world is built to keep them safe. 2 gulps. That's all it took. Her body didn't seize up, and she didn't scream or faint like in a bad soap opera. It was slower, subtler, more horrifying because of how real it felt. She blinked. Once. Twice. Then her mouth twisted slightly, not quite a frown, more like confusion. Her hand trembled a little as she set the cup down. She looked at Mom, who was now standing in the hallway archway watching us both, and said quietly, but with this trembling fear in her voice that made my spine go ice cold, "Mom, what was in that?" It was the first time I'd ever seen my mother completely still. Not pretending, not performing, not scrambling for the right words to smooth over an awkward moment, but frozen, like someone had pressed pause on her very soul. And I just sat there beside Jenna, holding my own mug gently in my lap, my legs crossed, my heart not racing, my breath steady, my face blank. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. Because I didn't need to. The silence said enough. And for the first time in years, maybe ever, I felt like I was finally in control. Not just of the room, but of the truth. Of the past. Of the story that had never been told the way it actually happened. And in that moment, while my sister looked terrified and my mother stood paralyzed, I knew without any doubt that they both felt something they'd never expected to feel from me. Power. The kind that doesn't scream or burn or break. The kind that watches. And waits. And remembers everything. It started not with screaming, not with chaos, not with the kind of melodramatic outburst you'd expect from someone whose body had just betrayed them in a room full of people who still believed that everything was fine, but with something much smaller, quieter. Even like the sound of a subtle shift in atmosphere, the kind of pressure drop before a storm, the kind that tells you something is coming and it's already too late to stop it. Jenna's expression didn't explode into panic right away. In fact, for the first few seconds after she set the mug down on the coffee table, next to a bowl of half-eaten olives and a stack of cocktail napkins printed with her initials, she looked more confused than anything else, her brows pinched together just slightly. Her lips parted like she was about to say something, but hadn't yet decided what. She rubbed her chest, almost absent-mindedly, the way people do when they're trying to locate a discomfort they can't quite name, and then she glanced around the room with this flicker of disorientation, her eyes scanning faces for something reassurance, maybe, or an explanation, before finally settling on mine. And when they did, when her gaze landed on me and didn't immediately move away, I felt a strange kind of calm wash over me, not because I wanted her to suffer, not because I was enjoying it in the way people assume revenge should feel, but because for the first time in my life, Jenna wasn't looking through me, she was looking at me, really seeing me, like she knew, somewhere deep in her gut, that I was no longer the forgotten older sister standing in the background, smiling politely while she basked in every beam of light the room had to offer. She opened her mouth to speak again, but this time her voice was thinner, weaker, like the words were getting stuck somewhere between her lungs and her throat. "I feel weird," she said finally, and her hand moved from her chest to her stomach, pressing down gently as if that would somehow ease the tension clearly building inside her. "It's like my heart's going too fast or something." The room, which only seconds earlier had been buzzing with casual chatter and clinking glasses, went uncomfortably still. One of Jenna's friends, a woman in a bright red blazer who'd introduced herself earlier as a mortgage consultant, set down her plate of crackers and looked toward my sister with a concerned tilt of her head. My dad, who had been half asleep in the recliner with the game muted and his attention already halfway out the door, sat up straighter and cleared his throat, his eyes finally focusing. But it was my mother, standing in the archway between the kitchen and the living room, who truly stole the air from the space. She didn't move. She didn't ask Jenna what was wrong. She didn't even blink. She just stood there, arms loosely at her sides, hands twitching ever so slightly, her lips slightly parted in what I couldn't decide was shock or recognition or some twisted cocktail of both. And I watched her as she watched Jenna, and I realized something that made my stomach turn, not with fear, but with the cold, metallic bite of clarity. My mother knew exactly what was happening. Maybe not every detail, maybe not the extent, but enough. Enough to understand that the tea was not just tea. Enough to remember which cup was meant for which daughter. Enough to recognize that the wrong girl had just swallowed something meant to silence someone else. Jenna let out a small gasp, like the air was suddenly thinner, and leaned forward, elbows on her knees, her face flushing and then paling just as quickly. "Is it hot in here?" she asked, though it clearly wasn't, and then she looked at me again, her eyes wide now, terrified. "Rachel, what was in that?" And I, calm, steady, deliberate, took another sip from my mug, careful not to let even a twitch of emotion show on my face, and said, "It was just chamomile, I think." "Right, Mom?" The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loaded, swollen with tension, like a held breath that had gone on too long. Everyone in the room turned toward our mother, waiting for her to answer, and when she finally did, her voice was too soft, too rehearsed, and too slow to be anything but a lie. I just used some herbs I had in the pantry. Something relaxing." "I thought it would help her unwind," she said, though her eyes never left mine, and I could feel the heat of something old and rotting bubbling up behind that facade of maternal concern. "Maybe it's just a reaction to something." Jenna was sweating now, her breathing shallow and rapid, and her hand trembled as she reached for her phone, trying to unlock it with shaky fingers. I could hear her muttering under her breath, something about calling someone, calling for help, and one of her friends rushed to her side, guiding her gently toward the hallway where the bathroom was, as if getting her away from the crowd would somehow fix whatever was unraveling inside her body. My father stood now, fully alert, the color drained from his face, and for the first time in years, I saw something resembling fear etched into the lines around his mouth. He looked at Mom, then at me, and then back to Mom again, like he was calculating something silently in his head, like he was trying to decide which story he'd believe when this was all over. The room had shifted entirely. The party was over. The illusion had snapped. Everyone could feel it. A few minutes later, after hushed whispers and frantic footsteps and a voice on the phone with emergency dispatch, the paramedics arrived. They moved quickly, efficiently, not panicked but precise, like they'd seen this before, someone young and beautiful brought to her knees by something invisible and terrifying. They took Jenna out on a stretcher, her eyes fluttering, her words slurred, but still trying to make sense of what was happening. She looked at me again before they loaded her into the ambulance, and in her eyes was a question she didn't know how to ask, the beginning of a realization she didn't want to believe. And then, just as the doors were about to close, my mother, still frozen, still pale, still watching everything unfold like she was standing on the other side of a thick glass, turned toward me slowly and whispered something so faint I almost missed it. "You weren't supposed to drink it." Not an apology. Not a denial. Just a statement of fact. A confession buried in quiet horror. I smiled, just barely, and stepped closer, close enough that only she could hear me when I leaned in and said I didn't. She flinched, just slightly, but enough for me to see it, enough for me to know that for the first time in her carefully constructed world of control and manipulation, she had made a mistake. A big one. And I had let her. After the ambulance pulled away and the noise of shoes scuffing against tile, voices rising and falling in sharp concern, and phones ringing out directions finally died down, the house fell into a silence so unnatural, so heavy, that it felt like someone had taken a thick wool blanket and draped it over the entire room, stifling sound, movement, and thought all at once. The kind of silence that wasn't just quiet, but accusing. I stood there for a moment in the entryway, watching the empty space where Jenna had been minutes earlier, still clutching the sunflower mug in my hand, the tea inside now cold and bitter, and for a few heartbeats I just stared at the pattern of the rug. Brown and gold and rust, the same one that had been there since I was in high school, like it could offer some kind of answer to the question that hadn't been asked yet but was already burning through every wall in the house. My dad disappeared into the backyard without a word, probably pretending to take a call or check the garden, even though we both knew he just needed to breathe without being seen, which was his specialty, disappearing in plain sight. All my life, he'd been there and not there, occupying space like a couch or a fridge or a ceiling fan, always part of the room but never really part of the story, and now was no different. He wouldn't ask questions. He wouldn't demand explanations. He'd stand there in the backyard, pretending to water the grass, while the two women inside tore each other apart with looks sharp enough to scar and truths old enough to poison. And speaking of poison, I turned slowly toward the kitchen, where my mother stood stiffly at the counter, her back to me, both hands resting on the edge of the sink like she was trying to keep herself from collapsing, or maybe trying to decide whether to run or stay. Her shoulders were too still, too square, and her head was tilted just slightly downward in a way that made me think she was rehearsing something in her mind, a speech, an excuse, a story she could repeat to herself until it became true enough to say out loud. I didn't speak as I stepped forward, my shoes silent against the worn hardwood, the air between us stretching tighter with every inch. I reached the kitchen island and stopped, placing the mug down gently on the counter, the sound of ceramic against granite sounding far louder than it should have in that moment. "You really did it," I said finally, my voice quiet, but even, measured, not accusing, not yet. "You really made it." She didn't turn around, didn't flinch, but her fingers curled just slightly against the edge of the sink. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, and the words came out so smoothly, so automatically, that I could almost believe she had practiced this exact line 1,000 times before. "You made tea," I continued, taking a step closer, narrowing the space between us, with something from the back of the pantry. "Something you didn't label. Something that made your daughter's heart skip beats and her body shut down in front of a room full of people." Finally, she turned to face me, slowly, her eyes wide but dry, her expression carefully blank except for the slight tightening around her mouth. "It was a calming blend," she said, her voice perfectly reasonable, the way you'd explain an expired salad dressing. "I've used it before. It's nothing serious. Jenna probably just had too much wine. Or maybe it was something she ate earlier." I stared at her, trying to read beneath the surface, trying to find the crack in the mask, the place where the truth was bleeding through, but it was like looking into a mirror coated with frost. You could sense what was behind it, but you couldn't quite reach it. "You know what it was," I said, more to myself than to her, "and you know who it was meant for." Her eyes narrowed just slightly, a flicker of irritation slipping through the cracks, and that's when I saw it. Not fear, not regret, but annoyance. Like I had ruined her evening. Like my survival was inconvenient. I walked around the counter and opened the trash bin under the sink, not rushing, not making a scene, just methodical and quiet, and there it was, crumpled near the top beneath a paper towel and a banana peel, the same brown bag she'd used earlier. Its top torn unevenly like it had been ripped open in haste. I reached in, pulled it out, and carefully unfolded it until I found the label she hadn't bothered to scrape off completely faded black ink, worn by time, but still legible if you squinted hard enough. Digitalis purpurea, I read aloud, my voice low and calm, the syllables stretching in the silence like smoke. Foxglove. You didn't even hide it properly. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a second I thought she might finally drop the act, might finally say what we both knew, but instead she reached for the tea kettle and poured what was left into the sink. I had it for the garden, she said, as though that explained everything. I use it to keep the deer away. I let out a short, humorless laugh, the sound of it bouncing sharply against the tile. You put it in your daughter's tea. I didn't mean to, she snapped, the first crack in her voice sharp and jagged, and suddenly there it was, the first real thing she'd said all night. You weren't supposed to switch the cups. So you admit it. My voice wasn't angry. If anything, it was quieter than before, more focused, like someone steadying their hands before surgery. You meant it for me. She exhaled, shaky, and sat down on the kitchen stool, her shoulders slumping slightly as if years had finally caught up with her all at once. I didn't think it would hurt you. Just make you sleep. Just enough to slow things down. To what end? I asked, my voice sharper now, the edge of a blade beginning to show. What were you hoping for? That I'd finally shut up, stop showing up, stop being the reminder that you never loved me the way you loved her. She looked up at me then, and for the first time, there was no performance in her eyes. Just tiredness. Just a hollow, aching void where warmth should have lived. You were always too much, she whispered. Too quiet, too intense, too suspicious. You made everything harder. Jenna never questioned me. She never had to, I said, stepping back, feeling the bile rise in my throat. You gave her everything before she even knew to ask. You gave me this. She didn't respond. She didn't apologize. And somehow, that silence was louder than anything she could have said. I walked away then, not because I was done, but because I needed space to breathe, to think, to gather what was left of the pieces she hadn't been able to shatter. But as I crossed the living room and opened the front door to the humid night air, I heard her voice behind me, quiet, almost gentle, like she was calling to me from some other life. You'll never prove it, Rachel. I paused, my hand on the doorframe, and without turning around, I answered her with the truth she could never wash away. I don't have to. And I left her there alone in her clean kitchen with her foxglove tea, her perfect lies, and the knowledge that this time, someone saw her clearly. The night settled into that thick, muffled silence that only exists after something ugly has unfolded, after the kind of truth that people spend decades trying to suffocate finally claws its way to the surface, breathing, snarling, dripping in shame and disbelief. And the quiet didn't feel peaceful or healing, but tense and unfinished, like the story wasn't done telling itself, even though the characters were too exhausted to speak anymore. I drove home with the windows down, letting the wind slap against my face like a punishment, the hum of the tires against the asphalt the only steady sound I could rely on, because everything else, every voice, every thought, every memory that followed me like a shadow for so many years, had begun to warp and twist under the weight of what had just happened. I kept going over it, not just what she'd done, not just the fact that she had actually brewed something poisonous and placed it in my hands without a single flinch of remorse, but the way she'd said it afterward. The quiet way the words had slipped out of her mouth like they'd been waiting there for years, needing only the right moment to surface. You weren't supposed to drink it. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I didn't mean it. Just a fact, a correction, A note on a mistake she hadn't anticipated, like I had gotten the script wrong, like I had ruined her choreography by stepping out of line at the last minute. And even now, hours later, with the city dimmed into a blanket of sodium lights and distant sirens, I could still see the way she looked at me, cold, tight-lipped, as if she'd rather I disappear entirely than live another day asking questions she wasn't prepared to answer. But I wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't going to play my part anymore. That version of me, the quiet daughter, the easy child, the one who could take the hits and still show up smiling, died somewhere between the first sip of that tea and the moment I saw her freeze in the doorway, realizing that her plan had not just failed, but had also exposed her in a way she could never undo. Jenna was stable. That much I knew from the message I received just after midnight, a short and awkward text from our father, who couldn't bring himself to call and say the words aloud. She's okay. Doctors said it was a mild cardiac episode. Probably something herbal. Nothing permanent. And there it was again, probably. Maybe. Could be. The language of cowards. The vocabulary of families who refuse to call things by their name because doing so would unravel too many polite lies. I didn't reply. Instead, I stood in my tiny apartment, lights off, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the space, and stared at the little cupcake I had bought myself earlier that week, before I even realized what day it was, because some part of me, some stubborn, lonely, childlike part, still believed that if no one remembered me, I could at least remember myself. It sat in the middle of the kitchen table now, one single candle stuck into its center, slightly bent from the heat of the room, waiting to be lit, waiting to be noticed. I lit the candle, not because I needed the gesture, but because the silence needed something to break it. I watched the tiny flame flicker in the dark, its reflection dancing in the window like a ghost, and sat down slowly, feeling the weight of the day settle into my bones. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't speak. I just sat there, hands in my lap, staring at the soft glow of that single flame and wondering how long it would take before I started to feel something that resembled peace. Eventually, I whispered the words, not out loud, not for anyone to hear, but in my mind, like a private prayer. Happy birthday, Rachel. And for once, it didn't feel like a lie. The thing about revenge, real revenge, is that it doesn't always come with fire and noise and grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in the absence of apology, in the echo of an empty chair across the table where you once sat waiting for approval that was never coming. Sometimes, revenge is knowing that you no longer need to explain yourself to people who built you only to resent the way you turned out. Sometimes, it's watching the ones who hurt you begin to fear the very thing they created. I never reported her. I didn't call the police, didn't file a complaint, didn't even tell Jenna the truth, not because I was protecting her, and certainly not because I was protecting our mother, but because I understood something that only people who've lived in these kinds of families ever truly learn. Justice doesn't always live in the system. Sometimes it lives in memory. Sometimes it lives in distance. And sometimes, justice is just the quiet act of walking away while the house you were supposed to burn down crumbles all on its own. A week later, Jenna came to see me. She showed up without calling, her eyes hidden behind large sunglasses and her hair pulled back into a ponytail, so tight it looked like she was trying to hold her whole life together through the tension of her scalp. She stood in my doorway, awkward and unsure, and after a long pause, she asked to come in. I let her. We didn't talk much at first. She sat on my couch. I poured us tea, real tea, normal, store-bought, not mixed in secret from a rotting bag in a forgotten pantry, and we sipped in silence for a while before she finally spoke. She meant it for you, didn't she? It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an accusation. It was just a truth that had finally found its way through the layers of denial. I nodded slowly, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead, she just leaned back, her shoulders slumping, and let out a long breath that sounded like it had been sitting inside her for years. She always said you were too intense, she said, her voice flat. Too sensitive. Too dramatic. But I think she was scared of you. Because you saw her. And I didn't. There it was, something I had waited a lifetime to hear. Not forgiveness. Not love. But recognition. I didn't know what to say. So I just looked at her and said the one thing I had left. She'll never stop. Not really. Jenna nodded. I know. She left not long after, but before she walked out the door, she turned to me and said, I don't know how to thank you. I shook my head. Don't. Just don't go back there. That's thanks enough. And that was it. No big reconciliation. No teary embrace. Just two sisters, finally aware of the same truth, walking away from the same shadow. I watched her go, closed the door behind her, and turned back to the candle on my table, the one I hadn't blown out. I leaned over, took a breath, and let it flicker into darkness, the smoke curling into the air like a question that no longer needed answering. Because some stories don't end with justice. They end with survival. And sometimes, that's more than enough.